Ms. Zachry, tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Well, we were first interested, we found out we were both interested in the assassination. I was interested because at 11 years old, it was the first historical event that I really have clear memories of. My grandparents lived in Dallas. My grandfather was an oil man. My grandmother had been good enough to save all the newspaper reports, both Fort Worth, Dallas, any of the area towns, and I enjoyed reading them from literally day one. But even at 11 years old, I picked up that there were some changes that were being made, not just because it would make sense in reporting that new information would come to light, but that people's quotes would be changed perhaps from day one to day three. And even as a child at 11, I thought that was interesting that the news could be changed. And later we found out it certainly could be.
Ms. Peterson?
And I was lucky enough to study in Washington, D.C. during a spring semester. My senior year in college, I worked for David Dreyer, who was a U.S. congressman from California. And while I was working with him, I was also working on my senior thesis for college, and it was on the Kennedy assassination. And that is how I got interested. And then Katanna and I met at work, and we found that we were interested in the Kennedy assassination. It was coming up on the 50th anniversary. We knew that there was a West Texas Historical Symposium offered in our town, and we thought we wanted to write an academic paper that, and hopefully if our paper was chosen, we'd get to present at the West Texas Historical Symposium. So we started working on this project in January of 2013.
The book is a fascinating title, and I think that we will never let go of our fascination of the Kennedy assassination. And it's interesting, here we are in the year 2020, and we're still looking into that fascinating story. And let me begin with you, Ms. Zachry. I'm curious about what was it specifically about the assassination that inspired you to write the book? Was there any one moment or one revelation to you that said, you know, this is worth digging into?
Well, once again, even at 11 years old, when Sunday morning, the accused assassin was murdered right on live television, everyone I know was saying there's something wrong about this. This should not have happened. Could this possibly be an attempt to shut this man up before he gets a chance to talk at a trial? And so I think from right then, I knew this was a murder mystery.
Terrific. And Ms. Peterson?
Well, I'm a little different because I grew up in California. I'm not a Texan, so I didn't know all the politics that were involved with Texas history before Kennedy. And I became fascinated with Kennedy when I had read some interesting information on an autopsy and how there were different mysteries about the autopsy and what actually went on at Bethesda that day. And so I just started researching and doing and looking for information. I will tell you, I was very naive until Katanna and I started researching for this book. It really opened my eyes on government, different political philosophies, and on what the government can do to hide information from the public. I was very naive.
What was behind the government's efforts, Ms. Peterson, to hide information about Kennedy? What was that?
I believe that they wanted it clean. They wanted a one lone gun person being the assassinator. They wanted to make sure that it was clean, that different countries, we wouldn't think that different countries could be involved. And they wanted it quick and fast, and the Warren Commission really, in their investigation, only took 5 months to interview witnesses and get all their evidence, and their evidence was all supplied by the FBI. And if they would have opened it up and looked into perhaps more than one assassin or different scenarios of what could have happened in Dealey Plaza, they were probably afraid the American public couldn't handle all the different information, that if they would have done a thorough investigation, that we couldn't handle it.
It's really interesting.
And I just have to say, Katanna and I believe the assassination was a 3-part event. There was the planning of the event, the actual assassination, and the cover-up. So when you talk about a conspiracy is more than one person involved. It's not a dirty little word. It just is more than one person involved. Well, if you think Oswald planned it and carried it out, he certainly didn't do the cover-up that happened, because he was dead. So we think of it as a 3-part event, and we're truth seekers, so we seek the truth, and where the evidence led us, that's what we would investigate and confirm it all through affidavits, testimonies, doing research in archives, and not just going on other people's historical work on this.
It's really an interesting approach. All right. So, Sara, we continue to roll with this interview, and I'll ask one of the questions I asked at the beginning of our phone interview. What surprised you about the assassination that you investigated so closely?
Probably the most surprising information that we discovered, and this was to me because I had never heard of perhaps 2 Oswalds, 3 Oswalds, many Oswalds that were used as doppelgangers. And we verified this through 2 individuals that were on 2 separate abort teams in Dealey Plaza that day. And when we asked them if they were there, because basically they were there because they knew it was going to happen, that Kennedy was not going to leave Texas, and the last place the assassins were going to be able to do their job was going to be in Dallas. They were not going to let him leave Dallas to get to LBJ's ranch in Johnson City. And so when we asked these individuals separately, because they didn't know about each other, were you there because you knew Oswald was going to kill the president? And they looked at us each separate times, and they said, Oswald, which Oswald? I knew them both. And no, they weren't there to kill President Kennedy.
Who did kill the president?
There were many groups that were involved, and plausible deniability is you have a job to do, you only know what your job is, and you do not know everything else that is involved in the planning. So if you were part of the planning group, you know only your part of the planning. If you were a part of the assassination group, you knew only your part. It was on a need-to-know basis. If you were part of the cover-up, you knew only what your part was of the cover-up. And there were many groups that thought Kennedy should no longer be president.
What was behind their distrust or dislike of Kennedy, do you suppose?
One thing, he was Catholic, so you had groups that thought he was answering, that the Pope was part of his philosophy and administration. The mafia supported both Kennedy and Nixon during the election, with hoping that their man, whether it would be Kennedy or Nixon, would get in the White House and they would have a link to the White House. And when they gave Kennedy a lot of money to his dad, he told them they would have a prince in the White House. And then he gets in and Bobby Kennedy starts going after the mob, and the mob needed to stop that. That's one group. The CIA. Kennedy, the thought was eventually was going to put his brother in charge of the CIA. He thought they were too powerful, going back to Truman and Eisenhower, who were worried about the CIA. So he talked about disbanding the CIA. The CIA wasn't happy. The military-industrial complex, what do they know how to do? They know how to fight wars. They get money. The people that supply the vehicles, the bullets, that's a money maker for those suppliers. And if you stop advancing in Vietnam, or when he decided not to provide all the air cover for the Bay of Pigs, that made the military extremely angry. It made the Cuban exiles extremely angry. The John Birch Society was extremely angry at Kennedy. The oil men, because he was going to take away the oil tax, they were extremely angry. The Reserve Bank, there's just all these groups that were extremely angry with Kennedy. And Katanna and I, because we're in education, we want students to realize that this happened, and if we forget our history and we don't keep questioning the media and government agencies, this could possibly happen again. And we don't want any group getting away with this, taking out a president, when that's what an election is for.
The book itself interviewed, your work in this book involved interviewing so many people who had not been heard from before. What are some of the memorable things that you found out from this series of interviews about the assassination?
Well, thank you for that question. This has been a journey, an exciting journey for Katanna and I. We met so many people that, have touched our lives and our hearts. And we met a gentleman who was on the abort team. He worked for the U.S. Marshals. And what he told us that went down in Dealey Plaza that day, and he was also involved in the Bay of Pigs, he really touched our hearts. And then you have a person who worked in the Johnson administration. She was an aide to Cliff Carter, and we would meet with her several times, and she would open up to us each time, and she touched our hearts. We met individuals that worked for the Dixie Mafia, and when we were looking to interview different members, some of them would be waiting for us and say things to us like, oh, I expected you to be here 3 weeks ago. We heard you were around doing these interviews. Sometimes to break the ice, we would take brownies to members of the Dixie Mafia, hoping they would think that we were just little
Housewives?
little housewives making brownies, and we just wanted to have a good conversation with them. But there was a certain person that we met with that he was pretty frightening, and I will never forget him. And
An interesting cast of characters to tell about this JFK story. And when you reflect back on the stories that were told you, did anyone cast a light on the concern that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the assassin?
many of them believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the assassin, that he was what he said he was, a patsy. And when we interviewed these individuals, and we call them their oral histories, we then went to archives, and we went to different places where you could find testimonies and affidavits, and we researched to make sure that we could verify what they told us. And then it was interesting because they didn't know each other, but they would verify each other. And there would be researchers that would know of one of our ladies that we interviewed. She was in the Nigel Turner film that was on the History Channel, and no one knew who she was, but we did because we interviewed her, and just we met some amazing people. And it was fun writing this book because it is their story. This isn't our story, this is their story. And they are witnesses. And one thing about witnesses, you can't tell a witness that what they saw, that they didn't see what they saw, because they were there, or they worked for Johnson, or they worked for Kennedy, or they were there as part of the Warren Commission, and they knew what they saw. And we can't tell them that they didn't see that.
What was the biggest surprise from your research for you?
Now remember, I was naive, and my biggest surprise is the different cover-ups and how the manipulation worked from the FBI on that day in Dealey Plaza when the U.S. Marshals took them evidence of a shooter on the South Knoll, and the FBI said, put it in your pocket. We already have our evidence. We don't need that. Starting that very day, there were things being covered up. And as a person growing up in a family where you believed the government and you believed, all the news medias, that was a shocker to me.
What would you tell our viewers about the book that would make them want to read it? What is it that you think they will get from reading these stories?
The thing that is most different about our book is they are actual oral histories. And the oral histories feed into the bits of the puzzle of the assassination, because it is such a complex web that each of these stories are important because it fills in another piece of the puzzle. And these are stories they have not heard before. And it is written in such a way that in sections that you read a chapter, you can close the book and reflect on that chapter, and then pick up the book and read a next chapter. And then it's like, this is building. This is now a new story, but it builds on the other stories. And this is just, think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. Their stories are filling in the jigsaw puzzle.
It's terrific. Sara, that's a wonderful interview. I think now we'll go over to Katanna,
You're gonna sit right
if she
here.
wants to come on in. Let me begin with you, Katanna. I think the place that I began with Sara just a moment ago was what changed in your impression. In other words, we had the official story of the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Commission. What in your mind changed as you did research on this topic?
Well, for one thing, I hadn't realized that the Camelot version of the Kennedy administration was nothing more than a fictional story of Camelot, just like King Arthur, until I got old enough to read some of the behind the scenes descriptions of the Kennedy administration. My family was made up of half Democrat, half Republican. So the first Thanksgiving after the Kennedy-Nixon election was intense, I can promise you, because half of them were elated that Kennedy had won. The other half was terribly upset that Nixon had not won. And so from that point on, I would hear both sides. Why Kennedy wasn't doing what the oil men wanted him to do, why the oil men were so important to the economy and we couldn't just ignore them. And on the other side, why Kennedy was doing a wonderful job and he was helping with civil rights and we were moving forward in that direction. So both of those kind of gave me an overview of the pros and the cons of this particular administration. But I didn't know until years later that there was truth to the stories of him being quite a womanizer. One of the people we interviewed had been a steward on Air Force One when Kennedy was president, and he talked to us and said, yes, I saw Marilyn Monroe on Air Force One when Mrs. Kennedy was not there. And we said, well, was she disguised? And he went, no, she just signed on as a secretary and everyone assumed that was, a friend of the president's. And so what if she was the biggest sex goddess, in the world at the time? So I think some of the things that I found out about politics in general really surprised me. But then, we've reached the point where that's probably true of a great many, if not all administrations, and you have to put some of that aside and say, were there more accomplishments than there were flaws in this particular situation, and kind of weigh history in that manner.
How did your research uncover that the story that seems to pervade your book from the eyewitnesses or the people who were on the edges of this story? How does that story of the Kennedy assassination change what our perception is of the story based on official government reports?
So you mean how is what we discovered different from what the official version was?
Yes. What were some of the things that you all reached the conclusions of?
Well, some of the things were from, believe it or not, from news reporters. Some news reporters were put in a position where they had to change stories. Others had their stories changed for them. For example, there's a woman who happens to still be alive, Connie Kritzberg, who was writing for the Dallas Times-Herald. She was fortunate enough to have the Dallas Parkland Hospital doctors call her the afternoon of the assassination, and they gave her a blow-by-blow description of what the president's wounds looked like. She wrote the story up, realizing she had a scoop, and the next day when her article came out, something had been added that changed the description of the wounds. And when she called the newspaper and said, who changed my story? Her friend said, an FBI agent. So that was one of the first indications that even on the very day of the assassination, we were not going to hear the full story if people were going to be allowed to change reporters' stories. So that was one of the things that first caught my attention, that even people who thought they were going to be able to tell the story were being shut down by certain government organizations or even by some of the Dallas police. And they were not going to be able to tell their story. One gentleman that we interviewed had found a pool of blood up near what became known as the Grassy Knoll. He had a newspaper reporter take a picture of it. When the FBI heard about it, they were quite interested. They took the photos, they took the negatives, they never returned them, but they also told him, you realize this conversation never took place. And while he was being warned by the FBI not to talk, his wife was receiving a phone call telling him that if her husband didn't keep his mouth shut, she and the kids were going to be killed. So that tells you immediately that the official report is not all there is to the story.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone?
I don't think so. Now, some people will say, and Sara agrees with me, some people would say that he was totally innocent of anything, that he just happened to be Joe Blow, who was employed at the Texas School Book Depository, and he got dragged into something and made a patsy. Well, he definitely was a patsy, we would say, but you have to admit that a totally innocent man would not leave his job that afternoon and go home and get a pistol to go to the movies. I think that's the dead giveaway that he was involved in something. But as the chief of the Dallas police finally admitted after Oswald had been killed, they never had any proof that could put that man up on the 6th floor with a rifle shooting during the time of the assassination. So it's just as well that he was silenced, because he probably would have been found innocent, at least if they had moved the trial out of Dallas. If he'd stayed in Dallas, I'm not sure he would have been found innocent. But anywhere else with a good lawyer and a chance to be cross-examined during the trial, I think he would have been found innocent.
The bizarre spectacle at Dallas Police headquarters when on live television Oswald himself was assassinated. And what did you learn about that? I think you'd mentioned earlier that even though you were a kid of 11, that did not ring true to you. And what is it that you found in your research that would support that bizarre occurrence that morning?
Well, for one thing, Jack Ruby would never explain exactly how he got into the police department. He claimed he just walked in, and there was a police officer swearing to the day he died, he didn't walk past me. So there's quite a bit of speculation that he probably was allowed to enter through a side door, perhaps, in which case that means somebody didn't care whether Jack Ruby was there or not. Now, that doesn't mean that person knew that Ruby was going to kill Oswald, but there had been threats phoned into the Dallas Police Department. He was being moved so that he would be safer at the Dallas Sheriff's Department. Now, one question that comes to mind is, why would the Dallas Police Department not be the safest place in town? It should have been. And the second question is, how on earth does someone kill a prisoner who's handcuffed to a police officer with that many police officers around him? Why weren't there police officers surrounding him as they walked him to the car they were going to put him in? Why was he displayed prominently so that someone could step out of the crowd and put a bullet through his stomach? All of that just didn't ring true. Now, the fact that Jack Ruby was found guilty is obvious. He was guilty. The question is, did he act alone? Did he act impetuously? One of our witnesses who knew Jack Ruby well, in fact, she was having an affair with him, said, yes, that's the type of guy Jack Ruby was. There were lots of other people that said Jack Ruby didn't have enough political desires one way or the other to care what happened to Kennedy or what happened to the person that killed him, unless it would benefit Jack Ruby to do so.
Such an interesting part of the story. What have you learned that stays with you? In other words, doing research, there's going to be things that really pop out in your mind that linger with you. What jumps out to you now, Katanna, as you reflect on your research and your work on this book?
Well, one thing we learned quickly, and part of it came from, for example, Connie Kritzberg realizing that her story had been changed immediately. We felt like we needed to verify even other books that had been written. So we made a trip to El Paso and we spoke to an El Paso police officer. And his first words to us were, "I've already told this to another author. Have you read that book?" And we said, "Oh, yes, we read it. It was very interesting." And he said, "Well, then why are you here?" And all of a sudden, a big grin crossed his face. And he said, "You're here to verify what was in that book and what I told him." And we both said, "Well, yes, we are here to verify." And it turns out part of the story had been left out. And he told us some details that were different than what most people think happened in the situation he was involved in. So I think that's what I've learned is we tell our students, verify, verify, verify. Just because something's been printed in a newspaper or told in a deposition. One woman told us, I said, "Well, we have a deposition saying that Cliff Carter did so-and-so," who was an aide to Lyndon Johnson. And this woman who worked with Johnson said, "Anybody would lie if LBJ had told him to, even on a deposition." So we have learned that you have to do the background work and the digging to make sure that even what's been printed is actually accurate.
Final thoughts. I'm just curious what I might not have asked that you'd like for our viewers to know.
Well, I think one thing, like Sara said, that we've been telling students, research should be interesting. Hopefully you'll get a topic that you are interested in, and we keep leading them also to the fact that libraries and archives, we did a great deal of our research in our presidential archives that we have in Odessa. Libraries, archives, museums are full of documents that have never been put on the internet. And there's nothing more fun than to find a box full of documents that no one has ever seen before. And maybe they're personal handwritten notes by someone. We discovered who the man sitting next to the infamous umbrella man was, and that he was a West Texan. And then talking to her, that man wasn't part of the conspiracy. He was on an abort team trying to keep the assassination from occurring. So I think that's one thing that we want students to learn, is that research should be fascinating, interesting, and fun.